Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
From West Hollywood, and I'm going to have Gene. Gene's going to speak first. Give him a hand. Hi, my name is Jean Kissel, and I'm a very grateful member of Alanon. And the first thing I have to do is I have to thank the committee for inviting us, because I always get nervous and forget to do it, and I say, I forgot to say thank you. Everybody has been so nice to us, and the new Quality Inn is beautiful. And I also thank you for including Jack, and I like it when he's included in Alanon. He never goes to any Alanon meetings except when we share together, and I'm glad about that, because I don't want him to get my recipe. As I say, my name is Jean Kissel, and I'm a very grateful member of Alanon. And I'm going to tell you a little bit first about how I met him. He didn't look the way he does now. He was very young, and he had this black hair and big blue eyes. And I met him in Greenwich Village in a rooming house. And it was after I had gotten married at 17, a marriage that didn't work out because I lived in a little town on Long Island. I was born in Brooklyn. Is that a surprise? And the name of the town was Amityville. No, I'm not the Amityville Horror. I think I could have turned into it with a couple more years of his drinking. But in that little town, I was 17 years old, and I wanted to leave home, and you had two choices. You either moved to New York City and got a job, or you got married. So I got married. Not a good motive. It didn't last too long. I had a little girl, and when that marriage broke up, I was still pretty young, but I was old enough to move to New York City and get a job and start my life over again. I did some thinking at that moment. I was to do some thinking over the years, and every time I did some thinking, we got in trouble. He just drank. I just got us into trouble because I was always thinking, you know. And so I said, well, I know I made a mistake here, so I'm going to move to New York City. I'm going to get a job. I'll get an apartment, and then I'll meet a really great guy, and we'll go together, we'll get married, and then we'll move to the suburbs, and we'll have a dog and a cat and a boy and a girl and a station wagon, and he'll come home at 6 o'clock every night, and he'll read the paper while I make dinner. We'll go to PTA meetings. Now, I met Jack, so I'm going to tell you what really happened. I met him in this Greenwich Village rooming house. I had a room in the back of the hall, and he moved into a room in the front of the hall. And these rooms were so small that when you were in them, you left the door open. And every time he was in his room with the door open, you could look down there and see the mess he had. He certainly needed somebody to take care of him. You could tell that right away. And he was really nice, cute, really a nice guy, looked great. And we never really did connect until one night I was sitting in my room, and I was minding my own business, just sitting there, not bothering anybody, and which is unusual for me to mind my own business. We had a skit today in Alanon, and I was sitting next to Dolores, and Dolores and I were identifying with everybody who got up. And we decided we're never going to get rid of our defects of character. They just keep coming back all the time. But so he came walking down the hall that night, and he had a quart of beer underneath one arm, and he had a book of poetry underneath the other arm. And he came in my room, and he sat down, and he drank his beer, and he read me poetry. Now, he read me Dylan Thomas. I didn't know that Dylan Thomas had died of alcoholism in New York. I also didn't know that Jack had come to New York to take Dylan Thomas's place. But you know something? I was brought up with a philosophy. My grandmother brought me up, my great-grandmother, and they were two tough ladies. They took care of themselves, and they always told me, if you want something bad enough, you work hard and you'll get it. And that's the way I felt about everything. So if you had told me that night, this guy moved to New York City, he wants to be like this poet that drank. That's all he did was sit in the White Horse Tavern and drink, I would have said, don't worry about a thing. I can handle this. As soon as I get, a hold of him, he had a very good resume. He was Irish Catholic from South Bend, Indiana. He'd been to Notre Dame. He'd come to New York. He was going to do acting, but he also went to Fordham and to Columbia. He was well educated. I mean, that's, perfect, right? I could see him in a house in Connecticut, reading the paper while I made dinner. Well, I was with him for about a year. We got married, and we were together about a year in New York, and I got the idea. All of a sudden, one day, it dawned on me. We were not on our way to the suburbs. Something had gone wrong. What did I do wrong, So I sat down, I did some thinking. Now, if you're a nice Jewish girl from Brooklyn and you marry an Irish Catholic from South Bend, Indiana, what would you think? They all have a bunch of kids, right? That's what's wrong with this marriage. We just have this one little girl that he adopted, but he needs a bunch of children. All the Irish have a bunch of children, and they all drink, I mean, that's the word for it. So, his drinking really didn't bother me, and a lot of it was because he was Irish. And I knew that the Irish all drank. I didn't know that they didn't know how not to drink. Over the years, I've met a couple of Irishmen who didn't drink, and I want to go and take their inventory and see if they're really Irish. I don't believe it. But anyway, so his drinking was really not a problem at first, but you could see things weren't going right. They weren't going according to my recipe. So I decided we needed some children. Well, 3 children later, meaning we had a total of 4, we still weren't in the suburbs, and nothing was changed. The only thing I really did was every time I came up with one of these solutions that I thought out very carefully was they backfired. I just gave him more freedom. He was always out. I used to work all day, come home, take care of the children. By this time, we lived 5 flights up in an apartment down in the Italian section of New York City, which was right on the border of Mulberry Street, and we had moved all over the place because I kept moving us, too. I was a geographic. I kept thinking, all these different places we lived, each one of them would be better, and all I ever did was move him closer to his favorite bar, and I did that right up to the end. The last house I found in Hollywood was real close to Barney's Beanery. It was almost like he was whispering in my ear, move me closer, move me closer. And, but here we were, these children, and he's out, and, and I'm losing control. I can feel, something is going wrong here. Why isn't it working? So I sat down and thought again, and things always seem to happen. I had a lot of trouble with a higher power when I got here. I hadn't given it up. I just never had it. And my sponsor told me to sit down and think of all the things that I call coincidences and good luck and attribute that to a higher power. And one of the things that I always said was, what a coincidence. We were walking down in the village in New York one Saturday morning, and this fellow came up and said to Jack, Jack, you've got all these kids and your wife and all of this. Why don't you get yourself a job and move out of this city? And it was about a month later that Jack got a job teaching in New Rochelle. And I said, what good luck that guy came along, And I could take over the years all those little incidences like that. And I found out that there was always a higher power in my life. I just ignored him because I thought I was smarter, And so we finally did move to the suburbs. And, all this time, Jack, as I say, when I first met him, I thought he was more fun than anybody had ever met. He was the life of every party. We had good times together. Oh, every once in a while, he'd drink too much. And he'd get either nasty or sleepy, or he'd get sick or something, or he'd go off someplace. But it didn't happen too often. But I didn't know about alcoholism, and I didn't know that alcoholism was a progressive illness. So it kept progressing slowly in our life. And these incidents got closer and closer together. And I don't quite know when I crossed over that line where it really started to bother me. When I started saying things like, Jack, don't drink before we go to the party. Wait till we get there. Or, Jack, you've had enough to drink. Don't drink anymore. And I would get louder and louder. It got so when we got here, we didn't have any friends left because nobody wanted to invite us over because we always had this big fight. And I'm sure everybody shook their head and said, boy, if I were married to her, I'd drink too. But see, he was fine. He was terrific at the parties. It was on the way home and only got home because we had a battle over the years. I was always trying to keep him home, and he was always trying to get out because he was a bar drinker. He was a runner, you know. He would just, you know, he was always all over the place. And we had a little thing going for years where every night, right after dinner, there'd be a big fight at dinner, and right after dinner, he'd say, I can't stand this house, and off he'd go. So every night, I would say to the kids, hey, I don't care what he says tonight. We don't remark back at him. Don't disagree with him. I want him to stay home tonight. And I would say to myself, I don't care what he says. I am going to agree with him. I don't want him to leave this house tonight. And there'd be that fight at dinner, and off he'd go. And I never understood how it happened until I got to Alanon. And I realized that his obsession to drink was much stronger than my obsession to keep him home. And so he was always off and running, and it was getting closer and closer, and it was beginning to bother me more and more. And, you know, it's that thing, too, about when, you know, you don't see it and you don't know it, then I don't have to admit it, and I can deny it. And so it was so far I was able to hide most of what was going on in our life. But it got to a place, and this was when we were living in the suburbs, where Jack started staying out. He started getting drunk at the parties. I knew there were things going on and we weren't invited. And I got angrier and angrier. And as Jack's alcoholism progressed, I look back now and my feelings progressed. My anger, my frustration. Because all the time I was saying to myself, there's something wrong here. What do I need to do to fix it? I think that's why we come here so angry and frustrated and resentful. Because we really do believe that it's something that we can do to fix it. And nothing we ever do ever works. And so at the end of the 4th year in New Rochelle, Jack announced that he had gotten a job in Ohio. And I just about had it. I had run out of things, I thought, to fix this guy. And I thought to myself, I did some thinking. I said, Jack goes to Ohio, and I stay here, and I'm never going to see him again. And so when the agreement was, this was in August, the agreement was that he would go to Ohio, and if it all worked out, then he would send for us in time for Christmas. And that was fine. I didn't pay a lot of attention to his plans because I never intended to see him again. And it was when I heard him pitch in Alcoholics Anonymous, he talked about getting this job in Ohio, and he and his wife going to the airport, and he intended to never see his family again. So we both said goodbye to each other forever, and neither one of us knew it. But that's not the way it worked. 30 days after he was gone, that was in September, I got a phone call. He said, Jean, this is the best place in the world. You're going to love it. The people are great. The theater is wonderful. I mean, it's just great. I found a house for us to rent. Then he said 3 words that I still go to lots of meetings to avoid my reaction to. He said, I need you. I packed up everything and off we went to Ohio. Now, when I lived in Ohio, I said I was way out west. I'd never been out of New York City. We went by train at night. Kathy was in the 9th grade, and she cried all night long because she was leaving all her friends behind. Christy was okay. John had had dental work in the morning, and they'd given him gas, and he threw up all night on the train. Mindy was a baby. The train was an hour and a half late, and Mindy cried for an hour and a half. And we had the dog with us because they wouldn't take him in the baggage car. I got off the train in Ohio. Guess who was not there to meet me? I said, what am I doing here? Why am I here? I was going to stay back there. What am I doing? We were 4 years in Ohio. And during those 4 years, now, just like the drinking, it just snuck up on me. Jack always drank as much as he drank, from the time I met him. He always drank. But it didn't seem to bother. But I started noticing him drinking more and more. The thing about don't drink before the parties. Well, Jack was also into pills and dope, and somehow those things really frightened me. Alcohol was not a mystery. And Jack was getting stranger and stranger. And he was, and this was in the 60s. And directed this theater for 2 years, and, they let him go. They were always letting him go from jobs. I mean, they always lost the best teacher, the best director, the best person they ever had working there. I never could understand. He'd come home and say, they're not going to renew my contract. I'd say, God, they're stupid. They let him the best one they've ever had. And he'd look at me and say, I believe you're right. And that was that was the extent of, it's important to keep the alcoholic happy. I mean, if he's not happy, we're miserable. He's got to be happy all the time. So you just agree with everything, And so so then we went to a little college, the 2 years. It was 20 miles away from the theater that he directed. And he was director of theater there. And he was, by this time he was a hippie. This was in the 60s. And he used to have long hair. And he had a fringed vest. And he had a peace symbol he used to wear that was about this big. It was made out of hammered iron. It looked a lot more like a weapon than a peace symbol. But he was very strange looking. He taught for 2 years at this college, and things were getting worse and worse. And I was getting worse and worse. I seem to, as I think back on it now, as bad as his drinking got, my feelings, my actions, and my emotions got, it seems to me that all I ever did was yell and scream. And mostly at the children. I didn't do a lot of yelling and screaming at Jack. One, I couldn't catch him long enough to yell and scream at him. He was very busy in those days. But I would yell, and I can remember tiptoeing in at night, and the kids would all be asleep, and I'd say, I'm not going to do that anymore. Tomorrow it's going to be different. And at breakfast, one of them would drop a Rice Krispie on the floor, and I'd be off and screaming again. And I didn't seem to have any control of it, because when I was screaming, I was saying in my head, I don't want to do this. I want to be a good mother. I always, I wanted to go to the suburbs with a picket fence with a station wagon. I don't want to live like this. And things just got worse and worse for me. My feelings about myself. I had no patience with those children. And Jack was getting hippier and hippier every day, it seemed. He was particularly fond of the pharmacy students at this school. Now I know why. I thought they just liked him because he was a nice guy. We'd have these guys knocking on the door, at 2 o'clock in the morning, But all these things are confusing. You're trying to live a nice middle-class life, and all these crazy things. He's coming home at night, parking on the lawn, people are knocking on your door. And this is a very small town. It's a Methodist college that doesn't believe in drinking, I always say the alcoholic has it easy. He just has to hide a bottle. I was trying to hide a whole alcoholic in this town. So look at the way he did when he came home and he announced they're not going to renew my contract. And I told him they've lost the best teacher they've ever had. And he said, you're right. We sat down, the kids and I and Jack, and we tried to make a decision about where we should go now. And I took one look at Jack and I said, we better go to California. Christy always says the kids thought it was a good idea. They thought the sun might dry them up, So we sent the kids out here by plane, and we traveled in a great big car that we packed up, and Jack with his long hair and his peace symbol and everything, he was kind of nervous about things he'd heard about hippies in middle America, and they stop you in these little towns, and this big cop gets a hold of you, throws you in jail. You saw all those movies. And so we were driving along, and I did most of the driving because anytime there was a person, he would say, you drive. And he used to go hide underneath the dashboard. And, I did not know about alcoholism. I didn't know about alcoholism till I got here. And I thought he was crazy. What are you going to think? You're riding along this great... Remember, I lived way out west when I was in Ohio. And here I am driving this car across this great big country, and my husband's sitting underneath the dashboard, I thought, oh, my God. And it's a strange thing, too, when I think about that. I was really scared. And if any one of you were to call me up and say, listen, I'm taking this trip across the country and my husband's sitting under the dashboard, I'd say, for God's sakes, get out of that car. Get another car. Take a plane. Take a bus. Leave him behind. But something? I never knew I had a choice till I got here. It just never occurred to me that I just shouldn't stay right there with him. And, of course, the kids were at this end already. Otherwise, I think I would have just turned around and gone back east where I knew somebody. Because if you're under the dashboard, he wouldn't know where the sun was. He wouldn't know if I was driving east or west, we finally got out here to California, and it was the last 3 years of Jack's drinking. Now, I came out of here, my motive again, I was going to get rid of Jack. That's all I wanted. I wanted a big city where I could get a job, and I'm getting rid of this guy once and for all, you know. And I didn't know how hard it was to get rid of an alcoholic. It's like gum on your hands. You can't lose them. I heard my husband sponsor's wife talk once, and she was this little teeny tiny thing, and she said if she'd ever known, if Fred was a great big guy, and she said if she'd ever known how hard it was to get rid of Fred all those years, she would have stood her ground a lot sooner. And that's the first thing I thought of, too, when I heard that, you know. But they are hard to get rid of. We got out here, we had an apartment, we had the kids, and we lived in the Silver Lake section of Hollywood, and we lived in a house on top of a hill. Every time we'd leave that darn house, we'd lose it. You know, every time we'd leave, the kids would say goodbye forever. I remember one time us being on the freeway, we could see the house, we couldn't get to it, you know. And that was one of the reasons I hung on to Jack for a while. I figured he was the only one that could find our way home, you know. But he was really physically sick by this time. He was yellow, his stomach bothered him, and he was a mess, and he really couldn't work. But he was well enough every morning to go down and get the want ads for me. And he circled the jobs, and I finally got a job. It was a good job, too. I've been there 18 and a half years now. And so we got to work, and I was still, you know, all the time my plan always was to work, to take care of kids, and get rid of Jack. One of my oldest daughter's resentments were when we got to this program where she said, you used to sit there at night and used to say, it's over. We're not going to live like this anymore. I'm getting rid of him. Tomorrow you're going to help me with the little kids, and we're just going to, you know, we're just going to do it. We're going to get rid of him. And I used to have a shoebox. I used to keep all the bills in a shoebox. I never paid him. I just kept them in a shoebox very neatly. I have a shoebox today, too, I think. But I would sit there in bed with her, and I'd say, okay, this one for him, this one. Neither one of us had any money. I don't know who, you know, this one for him, this one. And she said the next morning he'd come home with a smile, a rose, a poem, tell me everything was going to be different, and I'd put all those bills back in that box and put the box away, and we'd be off and going again. She said she got so she didn't trust me. And I heard my other children pitch, too, because it was always the kids and I against Jack. But after a while, it wasn't anymore. I could feel that the kids didn't respect me anymore. Somehow, they always thought that I had a power, that I could change things. They knew it. Christy always says that the sad part about living in an alcoholic home is the Alanon has a choice but doesn't know it. The Alateens, they know there's a choice but they can't take it. And that's very sad, you know, because I just never occurred to me that I had a choice to make it better. And so finally we just, you know, I was working, he was running around, and I'll tell you, there's one thing about Alanon and alcoholics. They always say if an Alanon's got another drunk and let him have it, let him get it over with, he'll come here and be comfortable. Well, the same goes for an Alanon. If we still have a trick up our sleeve that we think might work, try it, then come back, we'll still be here. Well, I wanted out of that relationship. I wanted him gone. I couldn't. He was hardly ever home. I never could find him any place. You know, I started, you know, if you called, I'd just say, call him up at Sloan's. That's where he is. You know, I forwarded his mail there. I figured he was there more than he was home, you know. And other things were happening, too. I had a job, and I had friends at work, and I used to go at first. It was funny, because I'd go and I'd talk about the SOB at work, and I'd come in, they'd say, well, what did he do last night? And it was really funny. And after a while, they started looking at me and saying, why don't you leave him? Why don't you get out of there? And I didn't know, and so I stopped talking to them. And so I had nobody to talk to. I didn't know till I got to Alanon that I never stopped loving him. I always loved him. I always felt comfortable with him. I didn't like what he was doing. I didn't like the way we were living, but I didn't stop loving him. And I knew there was something more than what was going on in our life, and it was worth hanging on for. And I had to hold on. I had to try, as long as I could think of something, to try to make it work. And then I did get my last brilliant idea. I used to go to work from Silver Lake to Hollywood, and I'd always cut down this one street, and all of a sudden this house was for rent. And I stopped and I looked in the house, And as you opened up the front door, you could see there was a patio with a barbecue. Now, I knew that if we had that house with that patio and that barbecue, everything was going to be okay. And somehow, you know, the way things work, I talked that lady into renting us that house. I told her I kept her 2 dogs. That was part of the agreement. I didn't have enough money to rent that house. You know, today I go to a meeting every Friday night right across the street from that house. That's amazing. And so we moved up there, and all I really did was move him closer to Bonnie's Beanery. It backfired one more time, you know, and it just kept getting worse and worse until finally I knew that I just couldn't handle it anymore. And my oldest daughter, who by this time had left home, and she was married and living in Phoenix, she came back to visit. And she said, Mom, look around. Look at these kids. Look at this house. Look at you. Look at what's happening here. And again, that old thing about if you don't notice it, I can hide it. But if you notice it, I've got to admit it. I've got to see it. I looked at John. John was going to be 12 years old. He used to come home from school, come in the house, go in his room, lock the door, go in his closet, lock the closet door, and sit on the shelf of his closet. That's how scared he was. Christy was taking care of everything. She was old beyond her years. She used to call me up every day and say, what's for dinner, and I'd tell her what to take out of the freezer. She still says she never learned how to defrost, how to cook. She just learned how to defrost. And Mindy was going to be 7, and she was kind of oblivious to everything, and Christy was taking care of her. The house was falling apart. I wasn't too good together. All I did was sit and worry. The kids knew that if they just left me alone, they could do anything they wanted. But if they came in the house and said a word, then I started screaming and yelling, don't interrupt me when I'm being miserable. And it just, I had to look at it. I had to see it. And I looked at Jack. For the first time in a long time. Jack had gotten a hold of a TWA credit card somehow. And he used to fly. All I did for a while was take him to LAX and pick him up from LAX. And I remember one time, it's like when your children are growing up right in the same house, somebody will say, my gosh, how they've grown. Or you'll say that about other people's children, but you don't notice the ones right with you. Well, I don't know. I just hadn't really looked at Jack, I guess, in a long time, really looked at him. And I picked him up once at LAX, and he came walking towards me down that tunnel. And I looked and I said, that's not the man I married. That cute little guy that moved into that rooming house, he had long hair that was stringy because he was sick. His face was all yellow, and he was that sick kind of thin, not a pleasant thin. And he was, he was really very sick looking. His eyes were, it was like there was nothing in his eyes, and they were blue and flashing when I first met him. And I didn't understand, but I didn't know about alcoholism, so I had no compassion and no love. And I had a lot of amends to Jack, because all I did was tell him how horrible he was, how hateful he was, and why was he doing all these things. His father was an alcoholic, and he hated his father, and I'd say, my real big thing was, well, if you hate your father so much, why are you just like him? And I didn't know. I didn't know how terrible it was to say that to him. I didn't know that that was his fear. I was always saying things like, I was always thinking up, what's the worst thing to say? I'll get him. But it wasn't to do it to hurt him, really. It was to do it to change him. When I stood there on a Saturday night and ironed and just left it hanging around so he'd come home and say, oh, that poor girl, look how hard she worked. That was so he'd stop drinking, When I told him that about his father, it was so he would stop drinking. When I paid the bills that he, for the checks that he bounced, I did it because I loved him. When all these things, I always did those things because I loved him, and I wanted to change it. I wanted to change the reality that we had. And you can't change that reality. I don't have that much power, but I didn't know that. And Jack was really, by this time, was a real hippie. He came up to my office once, and somebody said, I didn't know you were married to a hippie. I said, I didn't know it either. He had this long hair and a mustache, evil-looking mustache. And he used to wear 2 pair of pants, red and black brocade and gold brocade, and flowered flounce shirts, and, the whole works. And he had a shoulder bag he always carried. And so when Kathy was there that weekend, we all decided that this was it, that we would get rid of Jack. And so, it's not easy, but we finally did tell him that he had to leave. And he went out that night, and he got arrested. And I hadn't been to Alanon yet. And here I had kicked him out forever. We'd had this long conversation after he left about how we were never going to talk to him again, and on, and the kids all accepted it. And I got this phone call from a street kid who said, Jack just got arrested. He just yelled at me to call you to go down and bail him out. Well, I was down at that jail so fast you wouldn't believe it. I hadn't been to Alanon yet. And so I just, I went down, and the jailer, this is one of those things I had to add to my list about a higher power. They wouldn't let me bail him out that night. And in fact, they argued with me. They said, I don't think your husband's in this jail. And I said, well, I know he is. Some kid told me. And then they just kept saying, no, I don't think he's here. I said, I know he's here because his purse is right over there. But they wouldn't let me bail him out. They sent me home. And I called him, he called me up the next morning and said he was out, and hung up the phone and wouldn't let me come and pick him up. And, and it's a strange thing. We had lived through a lot of things. I didn't know about the disease of alcoholism. I didn't know about blackouts. I didn't know about hallucinations. I just knew that all these things had built up. I remembered the times when he had called and was supposed to be home for dinner, and he'd call and I'd hear the waves. I'd say, are you at the beach? And he'd say, yes. I'd say, how do you get there? He said, I don't know. That's strange. That's crazy. I always knew how I got to the beach, And then the times when we'd be sitting in the room together, all of us, and the phone would not ring, and Jack would answer it and have a conversation. And I thought, oh, my God, this is really crazy. But I didn't know about alcoholism. I didn't know about these things. So that morning, all these things finally caught up with me. And when he came home, I said, Jack, we can't live like this anymore. You've got to go. And I went to work. I'm only going to tell you about this because I can't explain it to you to this day. I just know what happened. I went to work. I didn't know about alcohol or alcoholism, but I went to work and I got the phone book and I looked up alcoholism and I made a phone call. I talked to a lady at the end of the phone, and she told me about alcoholism. She gave me a number for Jack to call if he wanted help. And she, just as I was going to hang up the phone because I just found the answer for him, she told me, wait a second, you haven't always done everything right over the years, but it's okay because you didn't know any better. But there's a place for you to go to, and that's Alanon. And she gave me the number, and she said, I promise me you'll go. And I said I would. And I went home, and Jack did want help. We made that phone call, and he went to Oxnard to a 12-step house. And that week, that was on Monday, and that Friday I went to my first Alanon meeting. Now, I came to all of you in Alanon, dressed up, ready to get my typewritten list on what to do with Jack now. I thought it was sort of like a seminar, What do you feed him? How do you take care of him? What do you say? And you hardly asked me anything about Jack. You weren't terribly interested in him. And I didn't know much about anything except him, I thought. But I walked into that first meeting, and a lady came up to me, and she said, who's the problem drinker you're coming to Alanon for? And I said, it's my husband. That's the first time I said that. And from that day to this day, I've loved that woman, because for some reason, just saying that sentence, I have never been ashamed of loving an alcoholic. And during that meeting, someone raised their hand and said something about an alcoholic. And she raised her hand and said, you can do a lot worse than love an alcoholic. I love that woman from that day to this day. She became my sponsor. And she started, I had not a clue on how to change my life or live my life. I only knew how to make, I thought, it never worked, because I've been trying for 17 years to keep Jack happy enough so that everything would be okay with us. And that was my whole motive in life, was just to find out whatever it was, live someplace that would make him happy so we'd be okay, go to the restaurant where he liked the food so everything would be okay. And I would sit in parties and I'd watch your reaction to what he was saying so that he wouldn't get upset. And my whole life was just lived. I didn't know the meaning of the word obsession. And all of a sudden, you're telling me, take my eyes off of him and put them on myself. Who's me? I remember spending 1 hour in a candlelight meeting sitting there thinking, who's me? I don't know. And I started learning about myself in Alanon. I started working this program. I started learning about the steps, and she started guiding me and teaching me. The first meeting that I went to, after the meeting, she said to me, do you have any children at home? And I said, yes, I do. I have 3 still at home. She said, well, they go to Alateen and pre-Alateen. And I said, okay. And I just did everything she ever told me. And I took him the next Tuesday. Jack came back from the 12-step house that Sunday. And the next Tuesday, we all went together. And John always describes that car ride to that meeting every Tuesday night. It sounds awful. Everybody was sitting as far away from each other as they could, and nobody was talking, Christy always says the first year of sobriety is the only thing that was worse than the last year of drinking. It was tough. It really was. We were all learning a new way to do things. My sponsor said, you have to sit those children down and tell them everything you've ever done has been wrong, and you're going to do it different now. It does make a difference what time they come home. Yes, when it's cold, they do have to wear a sweater. And boy, they didn't take to that easily. But you know something? She started working, and she always did things in sneaky ways with us. She set it up. John didn't want to go to Alanon, but she set it up so that Jack and I had to force him to go together. And we became a team. And John still says the worst thing that these programs did for him was make his mother and father a team. But I'm eternally grateful that those children went to Alanon. I could never have brought them up the way they are today. They are terrific. It's really wonderful to be here, especially. It's 10 years. We stood here 10 years ago. And Christy and John spoke with us. And Christy was going to go to college the next week up at Santa Cruz. Mindy was angry at the program and angry at us, and we insisted that she had to come to San Luis Obispo. And she was sitting outside, sulking, because she was angry and didn't want to be here. We picked up a red cat at the gas station. We stayed at the Sands. We still got the red cat. And that was the only good part about the trip as far as Mindy was concerned. And Christy was going to go the next weekend to Santa Cruz, and we took her up there. And while we were up there in Santa Cruz, she ran away from home. And we didn't know where she was for 2 weeks. And we had just finished being here and being a family and 7 years on the program, and how could this happen to us? And Jack and I learned to be together spiritually during those 2 weeks. We had learned to be together as husband and wife before that. But spiritually, we learned. We sat down in Santa Cruz and we said, okay, we've been doing a lot of talking. Now we better do a lot of walking. And we did. We tried to be an example. We tried to listen to what the other alcoholics in Alanon said to us about that. My first thing was, don't tell anybody what's going on when she ran away. I'll tell you all about it after we get her back, But Jack, he's Irish and gregarious. He told everybody. So I had no choice, and he was right and I was wrong. Because you never pointed at me and said you're a bad mother. Instead, what you did was you gave me comfort. And you told me that it wasn't my fault, that I had done the best I could, and it was okay. And she, she did come home. And she didn't go back to the program until about a year ago. And now she's a full member of Alanon again. She has a sponsor, she goes to meetings, and she does service. And that's a miracle. And John, when we stood here the last time, John hadn't gone to Notre Dame yet and didn't know he was going to go to Notre Dame. And he's been to Notre Dame since we were here last and graduated as a B student. And we went to his graduation, Jack and I. There's a difference between all those other parents who go to graduations and us. They think they deserve to be there just because they paid for it. Jack and I knew it was a miracle. That boy should be in juvenile hall. Jack maybe should be dead. I should be crazy out there someplace. Instead, here we were with dignity, sitting at graduation at Notre Dame University in Indiana. He took us around and introduced us to all his professors and said, this is my mother and my father. He didn't even want to talk to us when he first got to the program. He was scared to death of Jack and had no respect for me. And that's a miracle, the miracle of this program. I found that working these steps, everything that I ever wanted in my life has come to me. I have found a family. I have found all the joy. I have found a success here. Success with my life. I feel good about me. And that started with my sponsor teaching me, because she didn't teach me to get things for me. She taught me to do things for other people with love, with unconditional love. And then I would feel better. And I remember Christy coming home one night, and I was busy trying to get us off to a meeting, and she was rejected by somebody at school. And what I wanted to say to her was, oh, come on, Chris, there's a lot of fish in the sea. Let's just get to the meeting on time. And that night I didn't do that for some reason. I stopped and I talked to Christy. And I talked to her about rejections and feelings. And I heard her pitch an Alanon, and she talked about that night. And she said, my mother didn't tell me there was a lot of fish in the sea. She let me find it out for myself. And I felt good about me. And when Mindy had her temper tantrums, and my usual way was to go in and scream louder than her that she should shut up. She was disrupting everything. And instead, one night I walked in and I put my arms around her and I said, Mindy, what can I do to help you? And I felt good about me. And when John started to share with me, and I knew that he was respecting the things that I was saying, I felt good. And I started to work my amends with Jack, because I owed Jack a lot of amends. I had treated him very badly. I had never had compassion for him because I didn't understand. And it was okay. My sponsor said it was okay for what happened before, but starting the day we talked about it, I was responsible for everything I did and said. And I had to make amends to Jack. You know, I used to scream at Jack that he was another child in our house and he couldn't do anything. And I know why today, because I did it all. I wouldn't let him do anything. He didn't know how to do anything. And I used to berate him and treat him badly and call him names, and I had to make up. And I had to give him back dignity. I had to allow him to, to be a person. And my sponsor helped me with that. She said one day, what do you want from Jack Kissel? And I said, I want him to be my husband and my lover. And she said, then you have to resign from a few jobs. You have to resign from being his mother, his nurse, his accountant, his confidant, and you have to allow him to do things on his own. That's scary, because that's where all the power is. If I don't know what he's doing and thinking, and if I'm not in on all his decisions, he may make some stupid one that I'll have to live with. Do you know, I found out how smart he was? He finally announced to me one day, he says, Gene, I did not get here because I was stupid. I got here because I was sick. That had never occurred to me. And so I was able to do that. And the funny thing happens on this program, she taught me to let go of all those things. And slowly over the years, all the things have come back. Today, when Jack is sick, I can nurse him. But I'm not nursing him in the same way as I used to. Today, I can be his confidant, but it's not to run his life. It's to share with him. Today, I can even mother him a little bit when he's feeling down. But it's okay, because it's not with the same motive as it was before. And we have become friends. So she took all those defects, all those things I did wrong, and turned them into something that was right. And that's happened all the time. I was going to Alanon about 6 months. I went to my Friday night meeting. I was glad that it was candlelight so they didn't see me blush, but I raised my hand, and very antagonistically I said, well, Jack Kissel's been going to Alcoholics Anonymous for 6 months. He certainly is no Prince Charming. And one of the Alanon men raised his hand and said, did anybody tell you you're not Snow White? That had never occurred to me, just like it had never occurred to me at the airport that he was leaving me forever, It's okay for me to leave him. But I began to understand that it didn't make any difference if he became Prince Charming if I didn't work on trying to be Snow White. Alanon and Alcoholics. It works. I know it. And that's what we've done since we've been here. We've stuck with the winners. We've watched them. We watched Jack's sponsor and his wife, and I wanted what they had, and we're working to get it. And I watch all the other people. And I had one problem, though, after we got to this. I was working the program, and I had made a lot of my amends. I don't think we ever stop really making them, because something always comes up that you remember. But, Jack and I were getting along okay, and things were all right. I had made amends at work. I had made amends with my friends. But there was one thing I discovered, but I didn't tell you guys about it because I didn't want to disappoint you. But there is one fault with this program, You can't make amends to your children. How can you do it? How can you make up for the school nights you didn't go to? How do you make up for all the times you wouldn't listen to them? How about all the nights I left them alone so I could chase after to find Jack? And when I'd get home, they'd tell me about the fights they had, and they were scared, and I wouldn't listen. Because if I listened, I'd have to do something about it. You can't do it. It's finished. You can't make up for it. And, one Sunday, I went to an AA meeting with Jack, and I was just sitting there minding my own business, and this woman turned around. She said, I'm an AA. Are you an Alanon? And I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, I went down to your central office, and I want to start a pre-Alateen meeting for my daughter, and they told me I can't do it without an Alanon. So will you do it? And I said yes, because I always say yes. She had gotten the time. It was 12 noon on Saturday, and, she'd gotten the park. Everything was all set for this meeting. And I just, I went home in the car, and I thought to myself, oh, I just got rid of my kids. 12 men on set. I work all week. I don't want this. What am I doing? This is crazy. Well, during that week, we decided that she shouldn't do it because her child was in the meeting, and she was glad to turn it over. And I got a whole bunch of three other Alanons, so there was 4 of us to do it together. So none of them would have to make too much of a commitment. And I started sponsoring that meeting. And I started doing for those kids what the Alateen sponsors had done for my children. I started telling them to wear a sweater, wash their hair. I started taking them places. I told them to wear their glasses when they read, and I started hugging them, and I started listening to them. And all of a sudden I realized what was happening. I was making amends to my children. This is a perfect program. The 12 steps are perfect. I was wrong. It has an answer for everything. And I was able to make those amends that were so important to me. And I was talking to Dolores and Chuck, and I said, they were the role models for my children. I pray that I am a role model to the children that I sponsor. That's all I want to be. I just want to love them and be there for them, the way Chuck and Dolores were. They never did anything spectacular. They were just there. And they just loved them and listened to them. And they're the ones that get the credit for bringing up our kids. We didn't do it. Today, those kids, 10 years later, it's such a miracle. Christy called us Thursday night. She's going to have a baby and get married in that order. I don't judge anymore. In fact, I said to her, when she told me she was going to have a baby, I said to her, are you getting married? And she said, oh, yes, right away. I said, oh, good. You never know. But I've learned to love them the way they are and not to criticize them. And she's going to graduate from law school next May. And she's going to come back out here and practice law. And she goes to Alanon all the time, and she has a sponsor in Washington, D.C., and she never gave up this program. John sponsors Alateen, and he goes to Alanon, and he has a little baby now, and he's grown up, and he married another Alanon. I guess he really is following Chuck and Dolores' example. And they're all together. The only one who didn't want the program is our oldest girl in Phoenix, and we love her a lot and pray for her a lot, and we share this program with her to the best of our ability, and pray that someday she'll want what we have. But for now, she doesn't. Everything has come together here. Everything that I ever wanted, everything I ever dreamed of. I just came to you guys because I just wanted to find out what to do with Jack next. Alanon, Alateen, and Alcoholics Anonymous are a gift in our life. Thank you for my gift.
I'm an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. My name is Jack Kissel. Member of the Great Fact Group of West Hollywood. And real pleased to be here. I thank the committee for asking us. As you heard, it's a very special opportunity for us to come back 10 years later and report. And I also want to welcome you to the Alanon Marathon Luncheon. I'm sure it's getting a little long to sit there. I don't know. Do you want to stand up and shake it out a little bit? Well, for a minute, why don't we everybody get up and stretch, huh? Big voice. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to correct some of the misstatements of fact that you've just heard. For example, she talked about driving across the country and attributed my hiding under the dashboard to psychosis, and paranoid behavior, and that had some part of it, I'm sure. But what Jean neglected to tell you, and what she didn't know at the time, is that there was some basis in reality for my behavior. I did look somewhat suspicious in those days, and we were driving across Middle America, and with her driving, we did draw less attention to the automobile that we were traveling in, and it felt right to me to draw as little attention to it as possible because we were transporting 2 pounds of grass across state lines. It wasn't all that crazy, you know. And Gene was able to document for you my behavior and what it seemed like in those days when I was on my very best behavior. You should have seen me when I was out of the house, you know, which was a lot of the time. My alcoholism was in full bloom when I met Gene. It didn't gradually develop. It was in absolute full blossom from the day we met and had been already for 7 years. I had started drinking when I was 16. I wonder what... We have a short somewhere besides me. But I don't know what's doing it. I just keep yelling. Oh, it's a hostile Alanon over there. He says, yeah. He's a hostile alcoholic, huh? Is that better? My drinking and my alcoholism got immediately into full bloom right at 16 when I started drinking. There was no doubt about it. So by the time I actually met Gene, we were in the midst of my alcoholism. It took a little while for it to begin to bother her and to affect our lives, and indeed it is progressive. But I mean, I was already in deep, serious trouble at 24 when I met Gene. I had, the first night I started drinking, to give you some sense of it, was when I was 16. I had already begun to behave alcoholically without alcohol. The isolation, separation kind of behavior was already rampant in me. I listened to Polly this morning, and she triggered a memory for me about my father as she was talking about hers. Talked about her father's being subject to rages, and my dad had that obsessive resentment that would come up when he was drinking, he'd just get triggered again and go over old angers and old pain and old fears again and again and again. And the kids used to call it raving. We used to say, Dad's raving again. You know, is he raving? You know, he's drunk again, is he raving? Because that was the most dangerous part of his drunkenness. And by the time I was 13, I was, as the book describes us, devious and cunning. Alcohol itself is just a liquid, so when it says we're dealing with alcohol, cunning, baffling, and powerful, I think it's talking about the disease, and it already started in me. So I decided to escape from that family without anybody knowing that I was doing it. And that takes a little doing, but if you're a devious alcoholic, it's not all that difficult. I was Irish Catholic in South Bend, Indiana, as Gene described, and so I decided to get out of the house by going to study to be a priest at Notre Dame at 14. Everybody approved of it, and it got me the hell out of the house, you know. So it worked well. And I went out there at 14, and I was there for 2.5 years for 23 hours of silence a day from the ages of 14 through 16, trying not to think about girls. And at 16, I said, what an order, I can't go through with it. And I came home. And the next night, some of the guys in regular high school invited me to go out with them, and we got some beer for the 5 of us. There wasn't a whole case to share, so there wasn't a lot of beer, but that very first night, some of the symptoms of my disease made themselves apparent. Among them was bad judgment. And if you're 5'6" and 120, belligerence is bad judgment, let me tell you that. And I was belligerent that night and for a lot of nights thereafter. On that particular night, there was one individual that irritated me, and I explained it to him. I also didn't think much of his family. I told him that, too. I think I was able to compress that whole thought into one word, and he beat me up 3 times because I didn't get the message the first 2 times. And then I had what I now know to be an alcoholic rage. And I just went maniacal. I was just trying to kill somebody. I remember I was told actually later, that I'd shattered the windshield of his car with the heel of my shoe. And 3 of them subdued, 5, 6, and 120, and got me in the car and put me on the floor, and 2 guys sat in the back seat and held me to the floor with their feet, and the 3rd one drove me home. And on the way home, I experienced a personality change. I just became warm and wonderful. And I cried. And I threw up on his floor. And they got me to my house, and they helped me up the front steps, and they leaned me against the front door of my house like a thing, and they pushed the doorbell and ran, because they didn't want to deal with my father. And my father opened the door, and here was his oldest son, 16, ex-seminarian by 1 day, drunk. My father did the only thing he knew how to do. He punched me out. And that was my first night of serious drinking. And I loved it. I never skipped a drink for the next 24 years to the best of my ability. And that isn't even all the things that happened that night. In addition, that evening I experienced a blackout. Now I know there are many people in this room who are not alcoholic, and there are a number of alcoholics who have never experienced a blackout. It's not a requirement for membership, you know. And so I always like to try and help people understand a little bit what it's like to be an alcoholic, so let me describe for you what a blackout is. For me, it was a period of time ranging anywhere from a half an hour to 5 days, during which I was extremely active and not present. It's the oddest thing. It's a strange experience. You can wake up in the middle of a fist fight and not know whose side you're on, you know. Find yourself driving 90 miles an hour down a highway, not know whether you're chasing or being chased, you know. It's very strange. It really is. And I had that very first night, you know. So there are many experiences that are part of my disease that are not necessarily requirements for membership, and I always try to mention that in an AA meeting when I'm speaking, in case some newcomer thinks they have to go through everything that all of us did, you know, and it's just not true. By the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had been arrested 10 times. I had totaled 12 cars. I guess I thought I was a test pilot for General Motors, you know, just trying to see if they would fly. And my liver was failing. I had hallucinated for almost a year and a half. Jean described one of my failures to cover, you know, that phone ringing that I answered. See, basically her job was to support the family, mother the 5 of us, take care of the accounting, be my confidant, as she described, my friend, clean up the house, do the cooking, and my job was to keep everybody from finding out how sick I was. Now her job is difficult, mine was impossible. Eventually that disease is going to make itself known, it's going to be clear. But there was that breakdown that occasionally happened in my efforts to keep them from finding out how sick I was. For example, answering the phone when it's not ringing. They're going to think you're acting strangely, you know. And it's, in order to hide the sickness, you really have to be alert. Because what you have to do is key off of their behavior, you know. So I grab the phone, and they all look at me funny. Maybe it didn't ring. Now what do I do? I mean, I can't very well hand the phone to the 7-year-old and say, honey, do you hear the phone ring? Is there anybody on the other end of this phone? You know, what I did was just hold it there, and I listened and heard a voice. But how do you know it's really there, you know? So I would just pretend that it was really there. I mean, I could hear it, and so I would pretend for the rest of the family. And that's the kind of thing that I was going through. But if you're new, in AA, it isn't necessary to go through all of those experiences to be a full-fledged member. I have a lot of friends who've never had a blackout, never hallucinated. I have friends who have never been arrested, never been to jail. They're perfectly welcome in AA, full-fledged members. We may look down on them a little bit, but they are welcome. So the situation that I was in by the time I met Jean was terrible. I was already in grave and serious trouble. I had been in 6 months drinking. Booze took me to this place. I was arrested and taken to a coroner's inquest for manslaughter at 17. And I was able to avoid those charges, didn't get taken to trial, and I'll tell you the truth, I was guilty, but I lied, and the little girl in the car lied, and a deputy sheriff cooperated and perjured himself to help us avoid my accepting the consequences of my actions. He had that kind of mistaken pre-Alanon generosity that allows the disease to continue. His motives were, he didn't want to interrupt the promising career of a bright young 17-year-old. I was from a poor family, and I had won a scholarship to the university. And so he helped me to evade my responsibilities. And I remember when at the inquest they decided not to take it to trial. They decided they didn't have enough evidence that it had been my fault. And that evening I got drunk to celebrate, you know. But he didn't know any better, and I was off and going. And over the years I found many people to assist me to continue my alcoholism. And the one who was most skilled and most devoted at that task I married, you know. I'll tell you how I recruited her. When I got to New York, I had already had a lot of trouble and a lot of efforts to try and discover what was the matter with me, and my most recent diagnosis of my disease was that I was too wild, too carefree, too irresponsible, too sensitive for this world. And I got in that rooming house, and I noticed Jean, she had Kathy. Kathy was 3 at the time, and Jean would take care of her on weekends, and it was quite clear to me that Jean was a good mother. And God knows I needed a good mother. So I hung out with her and began to go around. And Jean in those days was fun-loving, carefree, generous, friendly kind of a person. I enjoyed her a lot. She was a little strange. I noticed that pretty quickly. We went to a party. I'll tell you one of the first clues to her odd behavior. I took her to a party, and I knew some good parties. I used to hang out with jazz musicians. I'm not sure whether I liked the music or the booze. The grass, the weed, the marijuana, they could provide it. And so we'd go to these good parties. And we got there at this one party. I'd known her about 2 weeks, I think. And I noticed that she was a little strange. Because we were at the party not more than 15 minutes. And Jean forgot where her drink was. I had never done that in my entire life. I knew where your drink was. How could you forget your drink? I mean, that's crazy. Yeah, I had lost a few cars in my day, but I never lost a drink. I once lost Kansas City, you know, but, well, I didn't know if I was going to need Kansas City again. I damn sure know I'm going to need this glass later on. How could you forget your drink? You know, well, that's the difference between Jean and myself. She never needed to do the things I needed to do. And I couldn't understand her any better than she could understand me, even though we shared an awful lot of the problem. I mean, you know, a lot of the sickness and the sick behavior was mutual. We both did it. I mean, denial is a symptom of my disease, and I had it to an incredible degree. I tell you, I was able to avoid the information that I'm an alcoholic when the proof was already in the first night. And it took me, 24 years to get it. But Jean was good at denial, too. I mean, she had gotten rather skilled. Let me give you an example. When I was a professor in Ohio, there was a particular evening that I recall that was kind of typical of a lot of evenings. Where I would go out for a conference, you understand, and finally the bars would close, and I would get home, maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock. Very often near the end, the last 5 years or so, she would wait up. There were various reasons I understand now for that. It was usually not to welcome me home exactly. One of the reasons was to check on whoever it was I was bringing home with me, you know. Honey, I want you to meet my best friend. What'd you say your name was? He and I are going into business together, you know. And so she would kind of screen my visitors, and also it was just to, you know, to confront me once more. And so she would meet me in the 4 a.m. and one of her typical statements was, "Why the hell do you bother to come home at all?" And I'd always had an answer for that. It's the only place open, you know. So on this one particular morning, I drove home, and as she suggested earlier, I parked on the lawn. Well, I was exhausted, you know, and I fell out of the car, and I was so tired I didn't even bother to get up. I just crawled across the lawn and up the steps, and I was able to locate the front door key, and then I was unable to locate the front door, you know. So I was crawling around there looking for the front door, and Jean threw it open and looked down at me and said, "Have you been drinking?" That's called denial, you know. I remember my answer. I looked up and said, "God, I hope so," you know. So we were in plenty of trouble, and the trouble just continued, and the sickness progressed, and I got worse and worse and worse, and finally caved in and went to listen to a guy in Oxnard who had invited me to come up and talk to him. And I had just gotten out of jail the night before. Gene described that a little bit for you. And so I had a lot of difficulties and a lot of symptoms and a lot of defects of character. One of them is rebellion and defiance. I just can't follow your rules. I mean, I just never have been able to follow the rules. I used to run red lights for drill, you know. And this guy got on the phone with me, and he said, "Hi, my name is Bud. I'm an alcoholic. Can I help you?" And I don't know why that triggered something in me, but I said, "Well, maybe you could." And he said, "Why don't you come up and talk to me?" And we were in Hollywood, and that's a long drive, and I said, "Okay." And he said, "One thing, don't drink before you get here. Don't talk to me like that, you know." I mean, I stood in front of 4 cops the night before who were trying to talk to me in a disrespectful manner, you know. What the heck is this guy saying? And you know, a thing that always impresses me about the miracle of this program, it's that moment, that moment. Because I did not drink until I got up there to hear him. That's just not how I am. And, you know, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a great deal of research done on us. Ever since the insurance industry discovered alcoholism, there's been a lot of research done on the problem. Nobody's been able to add a syllable to the solution as yet, but we have a lot more knowledge about the problem, and it's valuable, I guess, and it's interesting. I try and stay current on it, because it's fascinating as they document and discover explanations for what we already know as experience. You know, like, for example, there's a line in our book which says, "We are like men and women who have lost our legs. We will never grow new ones," which has to do with the experience we have. No matter how long we're sober, if we drink again, the disease seems to have progressed while we were not drinking. And so we're worse off than we were. I sponsor a fellow now who has almost 6 months, who had 16 years. And he was in my house. drunk 6 months ago, and I had been his sponsor when he had 16 years, and it was incredible to see that the disease had progressed during his sobriety. You know, we're like men and women who have lost their legs, will never grow new ones. Recent research has pointed out why that is. One of the theories is that my metabolism is different from Gene's, and so I process alcohol in a different way, and when I drink, I manufacture a certain chemical called tetradihydroisoquinoline, familiarly known as THIQ, and I store it in my brain, and it is never excreted from my brain. So over 24 years, I managed to manufacture quite a bit of that substance, and it is just stored in my brain cells waiting for another drink, you know. And so I am like somebody who's lost his leg. I can never drink again with any impunity until they find a way to withdraw all that THIQ sitting up there, you know, and they haven't done that yet. So there's a lot of research that's developed, one is a sociological study that I'm real fond of too. It has to do with the fact that they say that alcoholics of my type negatively affect about 32 people each. Well, I mean, you know, it's easy to get to that number if you just think about family and friends and employees and employers and, in my case, passers-by, you know. Pretty easy to get to 32 people. So we negatively affect 32 people each, and they also suggest that for every sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, there are 19 practicing alcoholics out there, and at any given time there's about 1 million sober alcoholics, which means there's 19 million practicing alcoholics negatively affecting 32 people each, which is more people than there are. Which indicates to me that there are a lot of pre-Alanons out there being negatively affected 5 and 6 times a day, you know, because there's not enough of them to go around, you see. So they've got a lot of discoveries about it, but there are still many misconceptions, and one of them is that we are lacking in willpower. Now, any of the alcoholics in the room know perfectly well that we are not lacking in willpower by any stretch of the imagination. We have a great deal of willpower. That's even one of our problems, you know. We have too much in some respects. So the reason they don't quite get that is they just don't understand our goals, you know. I mean, I'd like to see them get to work on time, feeling the way we do some days, you know. You walk in and the boss says, "My God, you're green." You know, you say, "No, that's all right. I'll be fine. Just get me till noon, you know, I'll be all right." And so we have plenty of willpower, and I had exhibited some willpower that very morning. I had, when Jean left, after she described leaving and telling me she had to go forever, I had to go forever. I felt like I always felt, lonely, separate, different, angry, and afraid. And I did what I always do. I got a bottle of wine from under the kitchen sink and I drank it and passed out on the bed. But I had exhibited my willpower because I had saved a half a glass out of that bottle of wine for when I wake up. Now that is not easy to do. And I failed it a lot of times. A lot of times I'd wake up and I'd reach for it and the bottle would be totally empty. I'd say, "Jack, you have no foresight." You know, gee. But on this particular occasion, I had saved the half a glass, and this guy Bud said, "Don't drink," and I didn't drink that half a glass. Now that's the moment for me that is the least understandable. I hadn't heard another alcoholic story yet. I hadn't been 12 steps. I hadn't worked a step. I hadn't any detox going. I just got out of jail, and the guy said, "Don't take that drink," and I didn't. That's an incredible thing. One of the most amazing moments to me is that moment in time when the alcoholic is ready to hear it. You know, it's amazing. I had one experience I often think about. A guy, I 12-stepped a guy on the phone, you know. He called central office, and central office called me, and I called him. And he was in terrible trouble. Terrible, serious trouble. He had been in prison a couple of times, and he was accused, and he knew it must be true, but it seemed wrong. He was accused of having battered his 9-year-old son, but he didn't remember it at all. And he was drunk when he was talking to me, and he was agonized and miserable and hysterical and terrified. And he said, I've got to stop drinking. I've got to stop drinking. And I talked to him for a while, and I said, okay, what have you got in the house? And he said, well, I just got a bottle of Chivas Regal. I said, listen, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll hold, and you go pour it out. And then the next thing endeared him to me forever. Because the next thing he said was exactly something that I understood perfectly. I said, I'll hold, you go pour it out. And he had just told me how alcohol had destroyed his life. And then there was this long pause. And then he said, do you know how expensive a bottle of Chivas Regal is? And I said to him, it will cost you more if you drink it. And he went and poured it out. And 3 years later, my wife's Alanon meeting and my AA meeting combined in a Thanksgiving dinner. And 3 years later, he showed up at the Thanksgiving dinner sober with his son. And the moment started before he ever prayed, before he ever got to an AA meeting. That incredible moment when he was willing to listen to some stranger say, don't drink. And that's what happened. Bud said, don't drink. And then I went up to Oxnard, and we sat down and listened to him, and he told us what it used to be like, what happened, and what it was like then for him. He had a 1.5 years of sobriety, and I haven't had a drink since then. It's 16 years and 1 month and 23 days. And I haven't had a drink. I haven't had anything else. I have had no chemicals that I was so fond of, that I loved so much. I have had no assistance in getting through the night. And I haven't had a drink, a pill, no grass, no acid, mescaline, psilocybin, seconal, tuinol, nothing at all since that day. And it is incredible gift to be sober and to be a part of life which I had dealt myself out of. I wasn't working. The 4 kids were not speaking to me. My wife of 17 years was divorcing me. My liver was failing. It was all gone. I was babbling on the streets, my unconscious just speaking out all the time. I was hallucinating. It was a total loss. And suddenly it began to change. And it has changed since then. Gene told you some of the things. What happened for me was I couldn't work the program because I didn't believe in God. I was an atheist. One of my little entertainments in those days was I used to go to bars named Duffy's or Molly Malone's, and find some big Irish Catholic, and I was an atheist. I didn't believe in God, and I didn't think you should either. So I would find some big Irish Catholic and get him into a discussion. I'd say, do you believe in God? And he'd say, oh, yeah. I'd say, a loving, just, and merciful God, right? He'd say, right. I'd say, yeah. What about malformed children? And disease, and war, and poverty, and bigotry, and death? Where is your loving God? Usually about then, he would beat me up to show me there was a power greater than myself, So I saw no likelihood of being able to work this program. It talked about prayer from the first words, and I don't believe in God, so I didn't know what to do. I saw that I was an alcoholic. I was willing to believe that. I said, okay, I'll go to meetings, that I can do, and I did do that. And then I said, okay, the next thing I could do, I can't pray, can't work your steps, but I could get a sponsor, and so I did. And then I realized I probably got the wrong sponsor. I was probably my bad judgment again, because Fred, my newly chosen sponsor, did not have enough education to handle somebody of my complexity. See, I mean, he just wasn't intellectually suited to me. And I kind of gave him a quiz to make sure. I didn't tell him, but I asked him this question. Let's see how he does with this one. It was kind of a complicated question about the psychological interrelatedness of the steps. And Fred only had a high school education, you know. And he looked at me with these huge, gentle eyes, and he said, Jack, the steps are numbered for the intellectuals. If you will do them in order, they will work, you know. When I thought that was pretty adroit, so I didn't fire him, you know, but I was able to get honest with him, and I explained to him my problem, and I said, I can't work the steps, I don't believe in God, can't work the second step, I cannot come to believe. And he said the strangest thing, but he was always saying weird things. Anyway, he said, Jack, God comes to me through other people. And I thought, oh boy, there's that lack of education again, you know. If there is a God, it's ethereal or so esoteric. It can hardly be some dumb thing like that. And he said, go to the meetings and search for God. And I thought, oh man, all right, sure, Fred. But I was so desperate not to drink, I would even follow silly instructions like that, you know. So I did go to the meetings, and I did search for God. I listened to the speakers. I thought maybe somebody would unlock the door for me. And I mean, it didn't seem like that. It seemed like every speaker I heard then had about a third-grade education. They all got sober in Tyler, Texas, and they were dispensing folk wisdom. Oh, yeah, one guy got up, I swear to you, he said, if you do not believe in a power greater than yourself, then jump up and stay there. What the hell is that? I didn't think that was funny. I'm sitting out there trying to find God, and this guy is telling me that gravity will restore me to sanity, you know. How the hell is that going to work? So I just didn't think there was any chance. I went to the meetings. And I was also told, Fred told me very simply, do not use, do not drink, no matter what. No matter what. Don't use or drink. And I made lists of no matter what. You know, no matter what, if my mind is not restored to me ever again, I will not use or drink. And I could not memorize the Serenity Prayer. It took me 3 months to memorize the Serenity Prayer. I couldn't participate in meetings because I couldn't remember the beginning of my sentence. I would start a sentence and forget what I said. And so I didn't want to be embarrassed, so I shut up, you know. My hallucinations didn't go away the day I got sober. I remember one time I was sitting next to Fred in this meeting that was hotter than today, in a huge meeting. It used Brentwood Thursday night. It used to be about 500 people, and I was sitting next to Fred, and this huge black bug came flying right at me, and then darted between me and my sponsor, and we ended up looking at each other. Well, I didn't say anything, you know. The first thing that was said, Fred said. He looked at me and he said, it was really there, Jack. I didn't ask him, you know. I'd be damned if I'd asked him, you know. I was grateful to hear it, but I wouldn't ask him. So I said, no matter what, if my mind is never restored, I will not use, I will not drink, no matter what. No matter what. If those 4 children, the youngest is 7, the oldest is 20, never speak to me again as they have promised, they told me they did not love me, did not need me, and did not want me. They told me to stay out of their mother's life because I was killing her. If they never forgive me, I will not use, I will not drink, no matter what. If I never work again, I will not use or drink, no matter what. And it had been 3 years I hadn't worked. And if my wife of 17 years goes through with her plan to divorce me, I will not use, I will not drink, no matter what. If she stays, I will not use, I will not drink, no matter what. And when I took a 30-day chip, I had a spiritual experience. It consisted of being 30 days clean and sober. See, I couldn't do that, and I knew I couldn't. There's no way I can do that. It's just not possible. I just don't have the ability to stay away from booze and dope for that long. I can't. I just can't. And that is a spiritual experience, precisely as it is described in that most profound of books, Alcoholics Anonymous. In a rather obscure section of our book called Appendix 2, it says, we tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which we presently came to identify with our concept of a power greater than ourselves. Some of our more religious members call that God conscious. And I had tapped an unsuspected inner resource that made it possible for me to stay away from booze and dope for 30 days in a row. And I went to Fred and I said, I think I'm working the second step. He wasn't all that impressed. He said, go on to the third. And I did, and I have, and I do, and things have changed. My God, things have changed. You know, just in those 10 years Jean described, just in those 10 years. Mindy that she talked about, who ran away and all, and is now back to Alanon, she came to my 15th AA birthday. We gave a party at our house, at our new little apartment, and Mindy came, and she gave me a birthday card, and she had not been able to speak to me for 9 years. I mean, I was taught by my sponsor and others that I didn't need her permission to love her. So I kept on loving her, but she had trouble giving it back. And on my 15th birthday, she came to the party. She came to the party and gave me a card that says it's taken a long time. But now I understand how important your sobriety is to so many people. Because there were a lot of my babies there, and their babies, and their babies, and their babies. And it's an incredible gift that we're given here. Because, you know, Jean gave you a bit of a report on our family, on our children, you know. And I didn't want to tell about Mindy's running away. You know, I didn't want to do that. That's another error of fact in there. I didn't tell everybody because I was Irish. I told everybody because I'm an alcoholic, and my sponsor taught me that I am as sick as I am secret. And I had to accept the things I could not change. And if Mindy found it necessary to run away from home, then I had to accept that. And I had to accept Christy exactly as she was. And she told me things that I had a great difficulty accepting. When she was 16 years old, Christy told me she was gay. And I had a lot of trouble with that. And I did not call my sponsor, because I knew what he would say, you know, and I didn't want to hear it. So I had this friend in Houston, Texas, who was sober. And I called AJ. I figured he'd be a better choice. And I say, AJ, guess what the hell Christy just did to me? And I described my pain. And AJ listened, and he said, when I finished, he said, well, Jack, I guess live and let live applies to the children too, doesn't it? You know. I said I didn't have to call Texas to hear that. I could have called Fred. He'd have told me that, you know. And I loved Christy, and Christy had a friend, Catherine, that I love today. And things change in this program. And so yesterday Christy called us to say she's going to have a baby in April and a law degree in May. And they're getting married next month. And I'm grateful because I loved her all the time. I didn't have to wait until I approved of her to love her. And it was an incredible gift the program gave us. But see, I've got lots and lots of family. I came in here totally alone, completely isolated, absolutely separate from the world. I was good at it. You didn't even know it sometimes. I could stand in front of you, smile, be glib, and disappear before your very eyes. I was not there most of the time. And the program taught me over and over and over again, and still is, that my primary job is to not separate, but to join. And I was forced to join. And I began to join. And then the healing began to happen. And it has always been exactly as Fred told me. God comes to me through other people. If I am able to break down the barriers that separate me from you, then I have broken down the barrier that separates me from God. And the healing that takes place is not my examining myself with great care and developing my latest issue. It is to forget me and to forgive you, and my healing happens. I've come to know a lot of new ideas sober. I've discovered that there is no little 5-year-old Jackie inside of me needing nourishment. There is a 56-year-old Jack with old ideas needing correction, needing to replace my old ideas with the healing new ideas that the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous provide me if I will just let myself be loving. And amazing things have happened to somebody as isolated as me, somebody as separate as me. The Great Fact Group grew up around myself and my babies, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and we love that home feeling. And I've got babies and grandbabies and great-grandbabies and great-great-grandbabies. People that I don't know come up to me and say, you're my great-great-great-grand-sponsor, you know, and God, I love it. I mean, I love it. And it is family. About almost 14 years ago, I held a guy in my arms in the criminal courts building. He was facing an ugly little charge that we had to deal with, named Sean. And Sean had a little baby daughter 5.5 years ago, and when she was 20 minutes old, I held her in my arms. And she calls me Papa, and I'm her grandfather in every respect. She calls me Papa, and she calls her Papa Gene. Well, I think that's the proper arrangement, don't you? And Jean described how sick the disease of alcoholism made her, how angry she ended up being, angry at everything and everybody. And one of the little games that Kate and I have is, I would say to Kate, it started like this. She would say, my mom's mad at me. And I'd say, oh, really? When does Papa Gene get mad? And Kate says, Papa Gene doesn't get mad, you know. And that's a big difference. And Kate's as close to me as Paloma. We had the other day, Gene and I had Kate and Paloma. Paloma is John's daughter. She's 17 months old, and she reminds me of Christy. She's sweet and loving, and she may, if she hurts herself, she just gets hurt. She doesn't get angry. It's an incredible thing. I saw that in my Chris. So around us, family has grown. I've got lots of those grandchildren, like, you know, my Lara is my Kathy's daughter, and Sam, who is her son, and Paloma, who is John's. But I've also got Kate and Ja, who is Jerome's son. Jerome is a guy calls me sponsor, and he's black, and his son Ja calls me grandfather, and he's right. I am. So what eventually began to dawn on me is that the healing is in my joining. And one of the great gifts that I was given is an opportunity to grow with Gene, for us to start working on the healing, you know. And there's been a lot of problems, still are. We fight, still, you know. And I went to Fred one time and I said, you know, I'm 3 years sober and she still doesn't trust me. Still. And he said, well, let me see now, how long were you together while you were drinking? And I said, well, let's see, 17 years. And he said, okay, when you have 17 years of sobriety, you will be at 0, you know. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind Gina I've got 9 months and 12 days to go. And the healing process that began then. Fred told us, or told me, and then I told Jean, early in our relationship, that relationships born in sickness may not survive health. It does happen to many of us. That it just isn't always possible for the relationship that had so much going against it to survive health. And in our case, it has. You know, we're together now. In August, it'll be 33 years that we've been together. And we don't consider it an endurance contest. We're enjoying it, you know. But I've learned what it is and what it's not. One of the things that was read at the beginning of this meeting was talked about expectations and demands. And I had enormous expectations and demands on the relationship. It is the man, I have come to feel, at least the alcoholic man, who is too romantic about the relationship. And I thought it was supposed to fix me, you know. And giving up the idea that all it is an opportunity for each of us to grow spiritually, and not making demands on it other than that, has made it a comfortable and a loving circumstance that I never thought was possible for me. I really never did. I didn't know that I would ever feel safe and free. We're free. Jean's in this relationship because she chooses to be, and so am I, and neither of us need each other, and that's a different trip. It is a totally different trip with no expectations or demands. And I found a freedom in there that I didn't know. One of my babies told one of my other babies, don't ask Jack about relationships. Hell, he's only had one. But I do know that over the course of the 16 years that I've given Jean plenty of opportunities to grow spiritually. And she me. And that is a gift, another gift of this program. It has reached out and touched each of us in our nuclear family, and it has spread throughout the family of the program. And I'm grateful for every minute that I am allowed to participate in sobriety. And I know that eternity has already begun. I don't have to wait for the moment when it's here. It's already started, and all I have to do is relax. I came into AA feeling lonely, separate, different, angry, and afraid every single day of my life, drunk or sober. And if I work the steps and practice the principles and live in the fellowship of the Spirit, I don't feel that way at all. God comes to me through other people. Instead, I feel at one, at peace, and full of joy. And then I can live in the infinite now. Thank you for having us.
Sorry to interrupt your viewing. Taper Dave here. Just wanted to take a second to ask you to like and subscribe to my channel. Let me know if you like what you're listening. I've got some very good talks here, and this one's a great one. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Tell me what you think. Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, oop, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. I don't know if that shows up. The gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.